All right, this is the very brief review of how did the colonial army fight, or how did the colonists fight the world's largest navy? Well, Great Britain pretty much had the world's largest navy during the American Revolutionary War, and you can imagine that the colonists had none because we relied on Great Britain to provide our navy. So once the American Revolutionary War broke out, we are in trouble. So how do we solve this problem? How are we able to compete and fight on an open sea? So the Second Continental Congress, this is the Congress that met in May of 1775 and basically ran the government the entire time of the American Revolutionary War, decided we will commission 13 ships. Hopefully you're realizing 13 ships for the 13 colonies. Great idea. However, you're going against hundreds and hundreds of British ships and you're only going to make 13. And in reality, only 2 actually made it into the water. So not a huge success plan. So how are they able to compete? Well, the French Navy will absolutely help out, but before the French Navy joined, the colonists, relied heavily on privateers. And this is a private ship owner, maybe somebody who owned a merchant ship, who decided to turn their merchant ship into a naval ship by adding a few cannons and carrying a crew of officers or seamen. And so that's how we typically fought the British, with people in their private boats. And I know I joked around in class about having your own kayak or rowboat or something and going out to fight the Navy. And that's, for some people, that would be similar to what it was. So the local privateers were able to cause a lot of problems for the British Navy. The one person I want to talk about is John Paul Jones, mainly because he have a really great quote. His ship was getting ready to sink. He was in the middle of the ocean fighting against the British ship, the Serapis. After 3 hours, it looks like he's going down. And what ends up happening is like, "Do you surrender, Captain Jones?" And he says, "I have not yet begun to fight." And I only imagine that water is pooling at his feet and the ship is sinking at the moment he says this. And he says, "I will refuse to give up. Um, I will not give up this fight." And he actually ends up winning. So I think of Pirates of the Caribbean style, where you're kind of like on the ropes and you're swinging over to the other ship. That kind of fighting is going on at the time. And he is actually able to take control of the Serapis with his crew. And, not too long after he takes control of the Serapis, of course, his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, sinks to the ground. And this is this is Bonhomme Richard, that's his ship. All right, fighting in the southern colonies. We literally just read through this. Very little I'm going to ask you about this, so if you want, just please read through it. Please note at the bottom there's Francis Marion, the swamp fox, who used guerrilla warfare and caused a lot of problems in the South. Just a picture of the swamp fox. He used the hit and run tactics and then run and hide in the swamps. And the British don't want to go in the swamps. All right. This takes us to the last battle of the American Revolutionary War. This is a picture of General Cornwallis. Cornwallis has been tired out. He heads north to Yorktown, Virginia, where he is going to think of a different strategy and wait for reinforcements. All right, so he is at a fort in Yorktown. And what ends up happening is what we talked about in class just on Wednesday and Thursday. Washington had been up in New York. He's constantly trying to make connection with the French Navy, thinking if the French Navy shows up at New York, then I can surround New York and take back New York. It's all about taking back New York. But he does George Washington gets notice that Cornwallis is in Yorktown, Virginia. And it's about a 200-mile difference between New York and Virginia. And so he decides, I can have the French fleet meet me along the York River. We can surround Yorktown and we can surround Cornwallis, who is the lead general of the British Army. So it's a huge plan. And if it comes off, he could actually end up winning. So Washington heard that the French leader, Admiral Francois de Grasse, was headed to the Chesapeake Bay. Apparently they were around the Caribbean. So they're heading north along the Atlantic coast and headed their way towards Virginia. Washington, on the other hand, takes his men, and they march 200 miles in 15 days. So it's a little about 12, 13 miles a day that they actually march in order to surround Yorktown. Cornwallis is waiting for reinforcements, and of course, unfortunately, reinforcements do not make it. So this is really the perfect storm for George Washington. Once he surrounds Yorktown, the French fleet is along the York River, surrounding surrounding the British on the open water. The French and colonial troops surround the forts on land. They will bombard the forts for 3 weeks. Cornwallis is still thinking he's going to get reinforcements and that he doesn't need to surrender. That's why it lasts for 3 weeks. And eventually, like any good siege, they run out of supplies. That means that the British run out of supplies because they're in a fort and can't get any goods in or any goods out. So they run out of supplies, and Cornwallis is going to be forced to surrender. Apparently, he does surrender. The fighting does stop on October 17th, but it's not the official surrender until October 19th. All right, and you can see from this, the red is obviously the British, and the dark blue and purple are going to be the French troops. And you can see that they are surrounded. This is a strategic waterway. That's why you have red on both sides of the York River, because this would have been a major harbor or major area that you would want to protect. So if a ship were coming up the York River, you could fire cannon at it from both sides. The 4 ships are actually going to be representative of the hundreds of ships of the French that actually were in this area. They had more than 4. And so the siege and bombardment will work, and Yorktown will be the last official battle. I'm assuming that you can read, so Treaty of Paris, this is what it said. Please notice Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay are the ones who helped come up with this idea. It was not signed until 1783. That's 2 years after the Battle of Yorktown. It does take a while to diplomatically decide what you are going to give and get. This is not uncommon for a war to technically be over and a treaty not to be signed for another year or so. Please notice that Great Britain recognizes the U.S.'s independence. So we declared our independence July 4, 1776. By September 3rd, 1783, that goal has been realized. We have the territory that you think of as today. We have the Atlantic coast all the way up to Canada and all the way to the Mississippi River. France will control from the Mississippi River west, and then, of course, Spain will control part of that as well. Number 3, all British troops are withdrawn. That actually doesn't happen. That will be one of the causes of the War of 1812. Not all of the British troops actually leave. And since we are a small, tiny baby government, we can't force them. We are allowed to fish off the waters of Canada, so around Nova Scotia. The colonists can fish, lots of cod and everything. Fishing's a big industry. British merchants are, in theory, supposed to be able to collect their debts from the colonists, but that doesn't happen. Colonists don't pay them. And the loyalists who maybe got their land taken by the colonists during the war were supposed to get their land back, and well, that doesn't really happen. Some debt was collected, some land was given back, but not all of it. All right, the Newburgh Conspiracy. This is the very last thing. Washington is hanging out with his troops. They're waiting for the treaty to be signed because he doesn't want to dismiss everybody just in case war were to break out again. What ends up happening is the Continental Congress had originally agreed to pay pensions to the soldiers, and the Continental Congress realizes we don't have the money to pay these pensions, and so the army that's still with George Washington, that's thinking, oh, we're going to get paid, realize they're not going to get paid, and start talking about leading a rebellion against the Continental Congress and overthrowing the government that they had just fought 7 to 10 years in order to establish. Washington is able to convince his men that the Congress will eventually pay, and they do. And Washington also says, I am not taking a penny until you get paid. And so it just kind of shows his men that he is standing at one with them. So the United States, which was waiting to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1783, was so close to being overthrown by its own men early on just by not paying what they had said they were going to pay. And then this, of course, is where Washington goes home to Mount Vernon, hangs out with Martha for a little bit. And if you remember from our trip to D.C., that video at Mount Vernon where they both greet each other and then walk outside and look at the sunset. That's the moment after the Newburgh Conspiracy. Please let me know if you have any